Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Medina and I'm with Investors Advantage. For those of you who don't know us, we're a money management and financial planning firm located in Westlake Village. We've been in Westlake Village for the last 30 years. The company was founded by John Grace, who I'll be bringing on in a moment. We've been doing financial planning and money management for over 30 years, and we're proud to bring you this webinar series. And if you're not already registered, please feel free to join us for the next few Wednesdays. We'll be doing this for at least the next month. John, welcome.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And by the way, folks, it goes back to 1979. It's really hard for me to imagine, too. That's when I got my first securities license. And unfortunately, speaking of, how things turn out, have to keep your sense of humor. I put on a tie today, but somehow the video camera isn't working, so you get to hear my voice. I'm sorry you don't get to see me. Maybe that's a good thing, but I'm dressed for the occasion. Like I say, joke's on me. So before we start, let me let you know how much, by the way, I should say Jasmine Alvarado has been with us for, 7 months now. She's a mother and on her way to number 3. God bless you. Daniel Medina is my main math man. He's going on 14 years. Thankfully, without a great team, there's no way in the world we could do what we're doing here right now. And let me just point out, in fact, I was just talking to one of the supervisors in the hierarchy of our team. As a group, the team manages about $800 million with through Securities America, our brokerage firm. But for the most part, the majority of the financial advisors in the world today look like deer in the headlights. We have nothing to say. We don't know what to do. And in contrast, what you'll hear us talk about as we go through this is we've been preparing for something like this. We didn't know the name, but let me just pause here. We've said for a long time, you'll never know the name of the bus until it hits you, okay? You can't see it, you can't name it, but if you can be prepared for it, you don't care what the license plate was. And maybe if you get hit by it, you can pick up the license plate and tell your story. And that's the whole point here. We'll have some examples of that. But we've been preparing for events like this since 1970. Well, actually, we started in 1979, started paying for independent research in 1999. And that's where we really got into the weeds relative to what happened during the Depression and what could we learn from that in the event something like that happens again. So we'll talk about that as we go along. But I do appreciate you for joining us today. And as bad as COVID-19 might be, it turns out, it's the gift that just keeps on giving. It may be one of the good things that has come out of this bizarre experience is that we discover how much more we have in common. I like the way American poet Maya Angelou put it. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike. And maybe this might be the shot across the bow by Mother Nature, who along with Father Time hold the true trump cards, give us a chance to see what we have in common, and we better take care of ourselves. Otherwise, Mother Nature may say, hey, remember those ice ages you guys read about? Watch this. Okay, so we're calling this Conquer the Crash, and we're not just talking about the COVID crash. We're talking about the good, the bad, and the unforeseen, no matter the name. I like to say that it's not about the prediction. It's all about the preparation. If you're prepared for a 6.0 earthquake, 7.6 earthquake in Southern California, and it never happens, who cares? If you're prepared for an earthquake of that magnitude and it happens, and you can tell the story, well, that's what I want to do. I think that's what you want to do because things happen. I just want to be able to tell my own story as opposed to be in the news. So let's go over our agenda real quick. These are the things we'll be discussing today. And we've got a great speaker right behind me, a great friend, a great client, a great family. We'll talk about Dr. Herman Williams in just a minute. He'll be picking this up because in the first half, we're going to talk about wealth care. And then we're going to get to the meat on the subject is health care. All right. So that would be our introduction. We'll get to COVID-19 and the markets. We'll be getting into our recommendations. We have 3 essential steps to survive these kinds of pandemics and events that we don't see coming. And then we'll get to Dr. Williams in terms of, as a physician, we don't have access to Anthony Fauci. Apparently he's a little bit busy, but he's on the television screen 24/7, right? We do have access to Dr. Herman Williams, who can help us really get a sense for what is this? How does it work? What do we actually know? How come it's, who is it attacking? Where is it attacking? So we'll go there for you and make sure that we cover, and then we have questions and answers. and we'll talk about our webinars that we'll be doing every Wednesday for the next, at least through the end of May, and I think we'll be doing some in June as well. So let's look at a couple of my quotes. One's here, one I will repeat for you. This one's by Ben Franklin: "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." And another one that I'm very fond of is by Colonel George Patton: "If everybody is thinking the same thing, if everybody's thinking the same thing, then somebody isn't thinking." I think that's so true. And frankly, I think it falls right in the lap of those of us who are in the business of managing people's money. We all look alike, sound alike, say exactly the same thing. And I'm sorry, the only message we've really conveyed 100% is stocks for the long haul, hold and hope, sit and take it, buy and hold, no matter what. I've got news for you. We can do better than that. That's the truth. But that's 40 years ago, and we're still saying it as though it's true. So let's pick up on what happened today with the market. We see the S&P was off about 0.75% or so. The Dow was off almost a full percent, and NASDAQ was actually up about 0.5%. So what I would say is that as investors continue to price in the possibility of more states relaxing restrictive stay-at-home orders, stocks paired some gains today, but were little changed. Now, there is no direct correlation between oil prices and the stock market, but oil does seem to be something to follow as one indicator to where stocks might go. And notice today, crude oil settled lower, breaking a 5-session winning streak. We pretty much had a flat market today. This goes back to, in the screen, what's been driving this activity? Well, it looks like the peak was around the 19th of February for the year so far. And the low point so far this year, is the end of March or so, is about a loss of 34%. And I will tell you that some of my neighbors who are very retired, I thought they were going to cry. And they don't want to give any details, which is fascinating in terms of what's happening right now. Through the outbreak, the oil massacre, corporate interest rates skyrocketing, the CARES Act, quite depressed, but not depressed enough to want to do something about it, just feel bad, which is fascinating. So then we see New York hospitalizations drop, and the Fed had a fantastic Main Street lending program, and up until the 9th of April, we've seen a 16% gain from the low. So let's look at how this all happened. And this is fascinating, both to the left and to the right. And see, every coin has two sides, right? And then you got the edge. So notice that to the losses, they were led by huge losses in transportation, lodging, restaurants, businesses, sports and recreation places. On the right, kind of like after or during Great Depression 1, we see more people consuming more alcohol. So that's certainly been good for those providers, right? So there's always pluses and minuses. And by the way, speaking of the Great Depression, which people get depressed about, what I will say to you is please keep in mind that there were more Americans that became millionaires during the Great Depression than any other time in history. So while it might be depressing and we might feel bad, what I'm saying to you is when we recognize what's really going on and we have cash and we can take opportunity, we get gains. And that's what we want to do. So that's been the impact. Now let's look at how long we think this will last. And this is changing as we speak, but it appears as though, we publicly became aware of what was going on in China around the 24th of January. Existing cases, they really clamped down on this thing, peaked middle of February. It looks like it was about 25 days until the peak and almost 2 months until there were, the first day of no new cases. So you can see what the deaths have been and what how many people have cured or recovered. And when I go back to look at the Spanish flu, that was back in 1918, what I find is this: there were actually 3 bumps, not one. And I find that Denver and San Francisco opened early. Los Angeles did not. Denver and San Francisco suffered more deaths than Los Angeles that appeared to open later. So you've got this real conundrum where people are worried about their lives, but also their livelihoods. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I have to vote on life. And it seems like so many, particularly some of the folks I've been talking to, mostly my peers here on Command Central, where it seems like there's so many financial advisors, we are leaning in the direction of it's about the markets, about getting back to normal, getting things back up and running at the expense of people's lives. For me, that's a little expensive, but that's how some people see it. So now let's look at another piece of information, and that's about, will there be a recession? Back in December, excuse me, in the writings that I did for newspapers and in the publications and the news interviews across the country, whether it was TV or radio, I asserted that I thought the odds of a recession in December was about 20 to 30%. In January, I changed that to 80%. And in February, I changed that to 100%. So here we are. These numbers have been changing dramatically just in the last 2 weeks to a month, all to the downside. And the fact is, you can't see a recession until it's been after the fact, which is fascinating. It has to happen first. So you need 2 negative quarters. And here we are, base case that we see right now, off 35%, second quarter this year, followed by a 3% decline. That's 2 quarters back to back, which means, yes, the odds are of us going into a recession. I don't know how we're going to avoid that. And as I say, don't get depressed by this information. Just lean into it and say, I've got to understand it. And then let me see what I can do about it. Because there are some things you can do about it as opposed to just sit and take it. Okay, so let's get to, in fact, things that we can do, what we're calling our 3 essential steps to inoculate your life savings. Be more diversified than you've ever been before. For the majority of us, we have portfolios that are mutual funds and exchange traded funds, and you could be looking at 1,000 different offerings in your 401k option list and go, wow, this is just amazing. I'm overwhelmed. The truth is, no matter how many there are on most investors' list of investments, it's some combination of cash, bonds, and stocks. So we'll call that 3 legs under your portfolio stool. When we look at the endowments and the foundations, Yale is very interesting in that we count 7 to 8 different legs under their portfolio stool. Now, I'm not saying this is the mandate. I'm not saying you should follow that example. What I'm saying is that maybe it does make sense to look at what the smart money is doing, all right? And we can all agree that 7 or 8 legs underneath your life savings is certainly stronger than 2 or 3 legs. And I will also say that we've seen so many occasions where people are exponentially invested in one asset class. They got 80% of their life savings in municipal bonds, for example, 90% of their life savings in 3 residential rental homes, all right? And I'm saying to you, that's a recipe for some shock and awe, and I don't mean a pleasant one. So more diversification is an essential step number 1. Number 2, do real planning. Please do not just throw darts in the dark like a very good friend of mine is always having. What do you think about this stock? What do you think about that stock? I don't know. I don't know if that stock's going to turn out to be Enron. But here's what I do know. If you put all your money on that one stock and it doesn't play out, you're going to feel stupid. And if it does, you're going to feel smart. And the truth is, neither one are true. It just happened to go up and it just happened to go down. But the real question is, how much money are you going to need on the last day after your last paycheck? Notice that according to Quincy Crosby, PhD with Prudential, 54% of us don't have resources past 30 days. Really? That's how we've been managing things. Now, what's going to happen once you have your last paycheck and you get to look forward to the next 10, 20, 30 years? That's what we want you to focus on, so that you can see, here's what I'm going to do so that I increase the odds of having the amount of money that I want to have at that particular point in time. In the meantime, like we were just working with one good client yesterday, park some money in an age traded age fund, age weight based fund. There we go. And it's supposed to be getting more conservative at 2030. But what she did not see is when the market was off 50%, that account was off 48%. And when she sees that, she's like, oh no, I can't do that. How can I dial down the risk? And that's part of what real planning is to us. Recognizing what kind of risk can you accept. That's a crucial question. Unfortunately, my industry is great for asking you, are you a conservative, moderate, or aggressive? Do any of us know what those terms mean? The answer is no. I don't either. So let's get down to brass tacks from the standpoint of recognizing, is it an 8% loss that you can live with? Or is it a 40% loss that you can live with? And now let's design the portfolio where you can see the evidence that the portfolio in 08, for example, or fourth quarter 2019, performed within your specific risk of loss parameters. Because see, if it's doing approximately what you want it to do, you don't have to be preoccupied with what the heck the market does, whether it's this year, the next minute, or 10 years from now. That's why you have to keep looking at it and making sure that it's performing the way you want it. That way, you know, your chance of loss are reduced, and certainly shock and awe are reduced. And then number 3, active management is our third essential step. What that looks like is, in addition to greater diversification, think of it like the movie Karate Kid. Wax on, wax off, remember that? So in the, you know, if we look at the movie, we're gonna say wax off or risk off in 2008. In other words, maybe you were 100% invested in some combination of stocks and bonds in January, but by illustration only, and some of this is exactly what happened for our clients. Instead of the account staying 100% in stocks and bonds, whatever that combination might have been, the account by the end of December 2008 became 60, 80, 100% cash. So what that means for the year 2008, when the market's off about 37%, if let's say your account is off 19.85, those are real numbers, net after expenses, clearly after a 20% loss, you need a 25% gain to get back to even. If that loss becomes 50%, we need 100. If it's a 60% drawdown, we need like 150% gain just to get back to even. So we want to put the money in places where, for example, again, Karate Kid, wax off out of risk assets in 2008 into cash where it's safe. And then starting around March 9th, 2009, when the markets went from a very low point to a very high point, even, you know, relative to today, we are, for the most part, risk on. In other words, particularly in 2009, we want all the money back in risk assets to 100%. And maybe it's you know, went from 5% cash to 70 to 100% cash. And now we have, I'm sorry, 50 to 70%, 100% invested in some combination of bonds and stocks. And now if we see a gain of about 26% or more, we have more money 12/31/2009 than we did 1/1/08. Most of our friends and neighbors took about 4 years in their passive funds, be they exchange traded funds or mutual funds. They stayed fully invested. They participated in all the decline. They enjoyed the gains, but it took them, in some cases, 4 to nearly 5 years for those accounts to get back to even. We want to limit the time it takes to get back to even, and the only way we might be able to do that is by limiting the losses. Let's keep the losses low so we do not need a Hail Mary pass just to get back in the game. So those are our 3 essential steps, and what you're going to receive by virtue of being with us today, Jasmine's going to send you right after we're done a couple of things to say, hey, was this helpful? But there's a little cartoon that we did. It's all of 2 minutes, and it gives you a real case scenario. This is actually a rocket scientist and his wife in Seattle, where we looked at the 401k was 1.3. What happens to the odds of success if that 401k becomes 600,000? So you want to know this in advance, please watch the 2-minute video and then fill in the step 2 with your answers to 5 or 6 questions that helps you recognize what kind of loss in terms of dollars and in percentages that you can live with. And then we can change it. It's not cast in concrete, but I'm just saying that's a better structure to really nail down what kind of, you know, gains and losses are acceptable, and then how might we meet those expectations. What we've been doing is proactively calling our clients to review accounts and help them assess their risk. In some cases, we find people who said, you know, when the market was going up, they liked the volatility. When it's going down, they said, oops, I lied, reduce the risk. What can we do about that? Because I enjoyed all the upside. I don't want any of the downside, or certainly don't want most of it. And then reviewing your, that's what we call reviewing your real world risk tolerance. Because, you know, hypothetically, oh yeah, I can live with a 50% loss. Well, maybe not. But let's look at it from the standpoint of what's real for you. Okay, so I think that talks about, you know, how we do it, and this is a good example of somebody doing a very good job. So this was I used this for a talk in 2018 to about 100 of my peers, and I got this slide in 2018. You know, it actually was in the newspaper, and I got to use this because what I want to ask my peers, because it's just 100 of us and the door's closed, is how are we building our client portfolios. And I opened with the question, how is it that this house is standing? And what I got were two fascinating answers. The first answer was it was luck. The second answer was it was God. And the third one, it was divine intervention. I go, wow, gentlemen, ladies, those are all good answers, but they're not the right answer. This house was built to last a year before the Hurricane Michael. Now you might remember Hurricane Michael. This is Mexico Beach, Florida. And this is a good doctor, Dr. LeBron Lackey. And by the way, he has a great quote. If you want to have it last, build it above and beyond. So he and his nephew decided they wanted to build this, beach house as a recreation place for them to recreate when they wanted to leave town. I believe he lives in Tennessee. And so they said, you know what, this is hurricane country. And we want to build this thing to last no matter what. And again, this was 2017. So they started looking at, what can we do? And what they noticed in the experience was the winds were around 155 miles an hour. And they have a camera on the house on one of the eaves. And Dr. Lackey said he was nauseated as he monitored the house security camera, watching footage of the winds and debris whipping by his house. He was certain he was going to lose the roof at any moment. But Lackey and his uncle set a goal to go overboard to preserve the structure. They went the extra mile, folks, by adding concrete, especially in the corners. They added 1 foot thick concrete walls, as well as steel cables to hold the roof steady. They built the ground floor out of tall pilings with the house elevated above it to create a ground floor structure intended to give way with massive storm surge if necessary. And now it gets more interesting. They put pilings in the sand, but they didn't go down 10 feet. If I'm not mistaken, they went down 40 feet. So their agenda was to build this house for 250 mile per hour winds. Clearly they were successful. I use this as an analogy to say ordinary homes are built to standards, and this is what happens when the winds blow a little bit above standard or a lot above standard. Or portfolios are often built so they're pretty ordinary, they're average. What we like to do is above average work so that we can actually spend the time with our clients and talk to them about how is this working in your getting or impeding your progress to reach your goals or to keep you successfully retired no matter how the winds blow or what happens, in the economy and with the market. If you have enough money, who cares what the market does? All right, so that's our piece on wealth care. Now we want to talk about healthcare. And I'm so delighted that, as I say, we couldn't line up Anthony Fauci, MD, but we could line up Herman Williams, MD, who is a second generation client. It's a funny story about how we met and his parents became clients, and now his son is a client. So that's 3 generations. I'm really proud of that. And he actually wrote a book, and we gave that book to our clients, and he was kind enough to endorse and put their names in the book and to sign autograph the book, and it was a very nice gift. Now, Dr. Williams is an accomplished, forward-thinking, innovative healthcare leader with over 16 years of operations in the management of large and small, urban and rural hospitals and national clinics. He's had great success in directing medical staff services, redesigning medical staff bylaws, improving credentialing, designing peer review methodologies, and privileging processes and executing strategies for physician leadership development. So Dr. Williams is now a resident of Nashville, Tennessee, where my father's from. I should know that one. All right, and he has a fascinating personal story about his health and how some things kind of got in the way. And let me just start with this, Dr. Williams. I'm not a physician, I'm not a scientist, but it would appear to me, Dr. Williams, that maybe this COVID-19 started in some place like China, but it was the rich people who took it all over the world. By that I mean the people who are on cruise ships and on airplanes, for the most part, they're rich people. And what they did was they went someplace in the world, got this virus, and brought it back to the poor people, starting with the baggage handlers who typically work at the airport, but don't typically jump on planes and cruise ships like we, the rich people, do. So it seems to me that something's going on here, and we need to pay attention because the poor and the minorities, people in New York, seem to be the first line of defense with this COVID-19. So when my colleagues are telling me about how we need to get the economy going again, and I want to ask them, and I have, geez, how many baggage handlers do you know? How many people do you know on the front lines? I suspect it's not that many. But let me ask you to take it from here, Herman Williams, please, and bring us up to speed about what we can do, what we know, and where do you think we're going from here?
Thanks, John. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Look, it's an honor to be asked to be on your program and to be addressing your clients. And I just want to say thank you for all you've done for me and my family over the years with your incredible advice. And it's really an honor for me to give a little something back by just giving you a little bird's eye view of what I know about this COVID situation. And I'm going to have Daniel advance the slide for me since he's got control. So this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit and try and get through these because I'd love to get questions, but where did it come from, and a little bit about the characteristics. What are the symptoms? How can we minimize the spread? And then address what you talked about, John, is why the disproportionate impact. And it's not only race. You might be surprised to find out which sex seems to be disproportionately impacted also. And then we'll talk about the strategies that are being used to address it. And then we'll open the line for questions. Next slide, Daniel, please. So where did it come from? Next slide. And some general characteristics. It might be a surprise to some of you, but actually coronavirus it's everywhere. It's 1/3 of the cause of the common cold. So this is nothing new. Next slide, Daniel. And the importance here is when we talk about some of the testing and the challenges for testing is that because coronavirus is around, there's a lot of false positives going on. So people who think they may have immunity really don't have immunity to COVID-19, but they've got some immunity because they were exposed to a different type of coronavirus. So one of the challenges are to come up with a way to measure the antibodies that are specific to COVID-19. So some of the stuff you may know, but we'll just cover as a background. COVID-19 is a virus, which means that it's a non-living organism that cannot be treated with an antibiotic. And so currently there is no cure, there is no vaccine. It's thought that this particular virus, the COVID-19, came from bats, and COVID's other coronaviruses come from camels, they come from bears, they come from all sorts of animals. But this particular virus somehow was thought to come from a bat and to have arrived in a live food mart where they had live animals and somehow got intermingled and someone probably ingested it and then infected a human being. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's how it sort of took off. The official name of this virus is SARS-CoV-2. So SARS and MERS are also coronaviruses, and you'll remember we've had outbreaks from MERS and SARS previously in a similar fashion, but they just snuffed out and they just died and never came back. And hopefully we'll be blessed that as things warm up, that maybe this virus will fizzle out and hopefully we can control it and prevent it from coming back in the fall during the flu season. It's called COVID-19. That's the disease that SARS-CoV-2 causes, and it's called COVID-19 because it's a coronavirus that was discovered in 2019. It's transmitted through airborne droplets. That's very important. So you can only get it if someone sneezes on you, coughs on you, or while they're talking, somehow droplets get from them onto you, which is very critical, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to me carefully here. is very critical. That's why we're asking people to wear masks. And we'll talk a little bit about masks, and maybe there'll be some questions, but the surgical mask will prevent you from spreading the virus to others if you are, what they're saying, greater than 6 feet apart. If you're fortunate enough to have a stronger, more industrial mask like an N95 or a KN95 mask, then you actually can be next to a patient who is suffering from the COVID virus and still not be exposed. But it's protecting yourself from droplets is one of the key ways of treating this particular outbreak. You get it via your eyes, your nose, and your mouth. It's called the T-zone. If you draw a T from one eye to the other eye and down from the nose to the mouth, that's the T-zone where you are able to contract the virus from someone else. It's important to note that you can also get the virus from inanimate objects. So the virus, we'll talk a little bit in a later slide about how long it can survive, but the virus can survive on countertops, doorknobs, etc. And what happens is the virus is there innocently waiting for someone to touch it. And then, of course, we touch our face. And it's important to know that by the way, we naturally touch our face about 20 times an hour. So again, we'll talk more about this later, but one of the key other deterrents for the disease is washing your hands, because you don't know what you've touched, and we touch a lot of things and you don't know if there's anything on it. So washing your hands very frequently, wearing a mask, keeping your distance is also, those are three key ways to minimize your the possibility of getting this disease. And it is more effectively spread than influenza, which we, by the way, 61 million people die of influenza every year, but it is not as contagious as measles, which we were able to get under control. And sporadically you hear of outbreaks of measles. They're very contagious, but they're not, of course, as lethal as influenza or as the coronavirus. Next slide, please, Daniel.
While Daniel's moving the slide, folks, if you would, there's a button right in the middle chat. If you pose your questions, Daniel will be able to list them off, and whether they're for the good doctor about the health or for the money doctor, that would be me about wealth.
Thanks, John. Just start pushing the buttons and you'll see these are just some random dates that I pulled off to kind of highlight the course of this disease. It was first identified back on the 31st of December in Wuhan, China, and they thought it originated from a food mart. Some people are saying they think it came from, and why don't you stop there, Daniel, that it came from a lab in Wuhan, but it certainly had its origins in China. There's a lot of people out there, I'm not going to really speculate because I don't have any facts on whether this was from a lab or from the food mart, but I will tell you there is strong information that suggests that it wasn't man-made. This is actually a virus that they've been able to recreate and identify its properties. And you can just see this very short 100 or so day timeline of how it's made its way into the United States, with the first case outside of the United States was February 29th. It was named on the 11th. The first death outside of China was February 2nd. You can see that as of March 8th, that was the first time that the number of cases in the United States actually topped 500 cases. And then you can see on March 26th was the first time the number of US cases actually surpassed China. Keep clicking there for me, Daniel. And there is the final number at the time of me submitting this slideshow to John and Daniel last week, where the total number in the United States was 1,100,197, and there were 64,000 cases. And when I looked today, while we were on the webcast, the number is now 1,233,419 for the United States, with 72,812 cases as of right now. And those of you who are really interested in tracking the disease, you can go to the Johns Hopkins website, and they've got probably what's considered the most accurate tracking of the disease.
And Dr. Williams, when you say cases, you mean you're saying deaths, right?
No, there are 1 million cases,
Right.
documented cases, and there's 72,000 deaths
Right.
in the United States. There are actually 59,833 cases in California and 2,511 deaths in California as of this very minute. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a little bit of a comparison between MERS, SARS, and COVID-19. And you can see this actually highlights, as we talk about the impact on race, how quickly we are to name things after areas where we think they originated, and we sort of blame those people for causing this virus. However, there are many places in the United States where these viruses, their coronaviruses are, and they're constantly being surveyed and measured for their ability to spread. But one message I would say is it's really very dangerous to call a disease and name it after where it came from, so that people sort of associate the disease with something that particular race of people gave us. But anyway, you can see MERS was discovered in 2012. This one was from touching camels, and it actually had very limited transmission between humans. You had to be very close in order to transmit this particular disease, and I think that's why there were so few cases and so few deaths. However, the mortality rate was 34%, and so even those people who got it died very quickly. So again, that prevents the disease from spreading. Actually, the less lethal it is, the more easy it is for it to hang around. And maybe somebody has some thoughts or questions about the latest headlines, which are saying that the virus is mutating. I will tell you that the virus is trying to survive just like we are, and it survives by going from person to person, and the less lethal it is, the longer it's going to be around. So it's trying to mutate and adapt to this environment so that it can hang around. So mutation is inevitable. You can see the data on SARS was discovered also in China in 2002. That also was believed to have come from bats, which transmitted to civets and then transmitted between humans. Human to human contact is how we transmitted it between each other. However, a very interesting distinction is that with SARS, you can only pass it if you were symptomatic, which is a clear distinction between the COVID-19, because they're saying up to 35% of people are asymptomatic carriers that are passing the disease and actually don't have any symptoms at all. Next slide. We'll talk a little bit about symptoms. There's really two sort of presentations. 80% of people have mild symptoms, and again, there's a 30% prediction that there are 30% of people that don't have any symptoms at all. But of those people that have symptoms, 80% of them are mild, and then 20% of them are quite severe with shortness of breath, fever. And what they're saying is that the elderly population, elderly being 65 and above, sometimes present with just fatigue. So that kind of threw us for a loop when we were looking for people with fever and cough, and we found a bunch of folks just presenting with fatigue. This loss of smell and loss of taste, and then it can become quite severe and turn into a quite significant pneumonia. Next slide, please. This is just the data on the survival rate on inanimate objects. So latex and aluminum, 8 hours, cardboard, 24 hours, countertops, plastic, stainless steel, 3 days, wood and glass, 5 days. This is really important because if you just happen to be a guest at our house and you show up in a cardboard suit, you're not getting into the house for several hours because we put everything that comes to the house in 24-hour detention in the garage to make sure that we've given it plenty of time for the virus to die off, just in case the person, you know, the UPS person or the FedEx person had some of the virus on their hands. So it's very important, we think, as a precaution, to have a routine for bringing stuff into your house. It's very important to take all the things that you buy at the store that can be wiped off, to wipe them off. We put the vegetables in the sink, we wash them thoroughly. All of these sorts of precautions people may think are, you know, extraordinary, but I think there are ways to quite simply limit your ability to get this disease unknowingly by touching something that has the disease or the virus on it. Next slide, please. This is just important to note that if you look around the hospitals that have COVID wards, that 90% of the patients who are in those wards, in those units, on respirators, have one or more of these conditions when they were admitted to the hospital. They have diabetes, heart disease, lung disease, or many of them are obese. And so, again, as you try and think about what are my risk factors, I have heart disease, so I'm exercising extreme caution about going out, making sure that I always have a mask, making sure that we respect the 6-foot rule. My wife is the only one who goes shopping. I'm not in any heavily populated areas at all. So if you have any of these characteristics, I suggest that you exercise, you know, these kind of preventative measures, making sure that you clean things, that you wear gloves when you go out, that you wear a mask when you go out, things of that nature. Next slide, please. Okay, how can we minimize the spread? Some of these just basic things. First of all, stay inside. That's a good way, that's the best way to minimize it completely. But if you have to go out, wash your hands often, avoid close contact, cover your mouth. They often tell us to cover into, or to cough into the crease of your elbow, cover your mouth and nose, wear a mask, clean and disinfect countertops and surfaces in your home if you have visitors, wear personal protective equipment where you think it's feasible. This doesn't mean to wear a hazmat suit when you go to Ralph's, but it does mean it's not a bad idea to have gloves. They don't have to be sterile gloves. They can just be regular gloves from a box. And you should have some sort of covering over your face, not only to prevent your spread, but ideally to prevent someone else's spread from you. And we'll make these slides available if you want to read some of these details, but basically, we are now starting to get I understand Lowe's and Home Depot have masks. So there used to be a shortage, but I think we're starting to address that more effectively. What I've been told by friends of mine who are actually operating COVID wards is that if you have a surgical mask and you are greater than 6 feet, it's probably safe if you're outside or in a well-ventilated area to be with another person. I think the recommendations are now is to not get together with more than 10 people, but again, I would say just a handful of people if you find that you just absolutely have to get together to break the monotony. Otherwise, we suggest not getting together at all and just, you know, having a Zoom call or something like that. Next slide, please. Why the disproportionate impact? Next slide. I think it's important to note that there are already healthcare disparities in our country. If you look at the great quote down at the bottom of the slide, there's some great research out of Stanford that literally where they can predict your life expectancy by your zip code. There are people in Washington, D.C. who live in one zip code whose life expectancy is 85 years, and one zip code over, their life expectancy is 60 years. There are places in Washington, D.C. where the infant mortality rate is worse than a third world country. And so you take these already existing disparities in healthcare, disparities in access, disparities in income, et cetera, and you layer the COVID pandemic on top of it, and you can see how people are disproportionately impacted. And I just listed 6 categories that I think are important. So let's just go through those. Insurance as an example. People of color are about 2 times less likely to have insurance. So they're less likely to go to the ED for care unless it's absolutely necessary. Because if you don't have any insurance, they're going to ask you for a copay. And so you're going to be impacted because if you have symptoms, you're not going to go, you're going to stay at home, and you're going to infect those other people around you. Let's talk about financial. Apparently, by some of the studies that I looked up, people of color have about 1/10 the median income of their white counterparts. If you don't have access, as an example, to a bank, or if you don't have large sums of money in the bank, we're finding out that banks are reluctant to give you SBA loans, which people are using to actually help them survive this period of time where they're unemployed. A lot of the people who are not being allowed to stay at home are what we call essential workers. Well, it turns out that because of the financial classification and the jobs that people of color have, most of them are essential personnel. So they are frontline workers, and they're not able to stay at home like some of the others of us who either have the money to take off or have pay time off, other sorts of benefits from some of the higher income jobs. Let's look at healthcare. Again, the people who are most impacted by hypertension, obesity, COPD, asthma, are folks of color and poor folks, both of all races. And so those people are the ones who are going to be disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look at number 4, just 400 years of racism, if you want to have a real laugh, I was on Facebook last night. They sort of had a picture of how the police in New York were enforcing no mask in some of the communities of color, where they actually pinned this guy on the ground and he was arrested for resisting arrest and et cetera. And then they show another affluent white neighborhood where police are actually handing out masks to those people who aren't wearing masks. And so you get this distinction in how we are reacting to the whole pandemic. Someone also pointed out to me that they said, you know, many people of color are afraid to wear hoodies and other sorts of things that make it look like they're up to something. So one guy said, "You think I'm gonna wear a mask? It looks like I'm up to something and I'm trying to hide myself." So there's some people who are afraid to even take the precautions necessary because they think they're gonna be singled out because of their race. So these are all things we need to think about. Lifestyle, again, people who have the wherewithal to shelter, people who have the wherewithal to have access to protective equipment. You know, they tell you, you wash your hands as much as possible. You would be surprised how many people in this country don't have running water. So again, poor communities and communities of color are those that are in these categories and are going to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And lastly, we talked about some of this, the social stature. You know, we are the essential workers. We can't go home. We can't access some of the relief funding. Some of the discriminatory practices that were going on in the banks prior to the COVID crisis around lending are now rearing their ugly head again as it relates to people trying to get small business loans who are barbers and who run nail salons, et cetera. They are getting singled out and people are saying you don't qualify for a loan. Next slide, please. These are just some data that just shows what I've just said. This is just data showing the disproportionate impact of those people who have presented with COVID-19, who are both non-hospitalized, those who never made it to the hospital, and those who have known to die. And you can see the disproportionate impact on communities of color. And this is some of the data out of the District of Columbia, Mississippi, Georgia, et cetera, where you can see that, as an example, in Mississippi, African Americans only make up 38% of the population, yet they're 64% of the COVID cases. And you can see the disparity in the numbers of the population they represent versus the percentage of them who represent the COVID cases. Next slide, please. I love this one, boy. I want to be free to do what I want. Don't impinge on my rights. I want to walk the streets. Well, you know, first of all, I've shown some data here that shows that actually the shelter in place is working. And actually California, it's hard to see this slide, but California is out there. You see New York is the red line, but even New York is saying that they're reaching a peak in their cases after we instituted the social distancing and the stay at home, and California has come down in some of its rates as well. And so there's a real concern that we are opening too soon, and I guess we'll see. But as John mentioned before, when he referenced the previous pandemics where they opened too soon, there was a huge recurrence in the number of cases. And so, you know, you look at, again, if you want more information on this, go online and look at the comparison between South Korea, who had their first case the same day we did, and how they had, I believe, a total of 225 deaths in the country, and they're already opening up, and, you know, we're at the 1 million mark of the number of cases. And as I mentioned before, 72,000 deaths. And it was because they immediately closed down everything. They immediately tested. That's the other thing, is they identified whoever had cases, went immediately to a COVID hospital if they were sick, and if they were mildly ill, they went to a particular quarantine space, and they were able to snuff out the disease fairly quickly. Next slide. This really says there are two ways to approach this, with the understanding that there is no cure and there is no vaccine. We can talk a little bit about what sort of drugs are out there, but essentially there's just supportive treatment for people who have mild illness or to be hospitalized. You know, if you have mild, there's just stay isolated, frequent hand washing, avoid touching your face, make sure you have personal protective equipment if you have to go out or if you have to interact with people, like if you're a healthcare worker. And then there are these 4 treatments that are being currently tested. The hydroxychloroquine plus basically azithromycin is just what we know as a Z-Pak. Chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are treatments for other illnesses. And we found that there's been some suggestion that this mitigates the COVID-19 disease. But really, remdesivir, the top antiviral agent, has really risen to the top as the one that proves that it may be the most effective and may also help us to get closer to a vaccine. Next slide. And this is just an excerpt from an online article just showing the effectiveness of remdesivir. Next slide, please. Okay, let me pause there and take some questions.
Well, Daniel's lining up the questions. Let me thank you again, the folks who spent this time, but also you, Herman Williams, for taking the time to just really walk us through this. I mean, when you're watching on the news, it's an amazing experience. You may be on, I've done it enough, you may be on for 3 minutes. What can you cover in 3 minutes? It takes a little time to actually get a sense for the gravity of the situation, to comprehend it, and then look at what we can do about it. But when it's so fast and so hard and furious, it's really challenging to get a sense for what does this mean to me. So what questions do we have, Daniel?
First one for you, Dr. Williams, on the comment of mutations. Have there been any mutations, and should we be worried about that?
Yes, and yes. Next question. No, kidding. Yes, there have been mutations. They found some mutations in New York. So we should be concerned because as we're doing all this research trying to find either a cure or a vaccine, you come up with a vaccine and it may not be effective. Let me just quickly tell you how we approach the flu. We have a vaccine that is made up of many viruses, and it's a needle in a haystack. We think that the vaccine that we come out with each year is possibly effective, but it might not be effective for the flu that rises to the top. So it's possible we could come up with a vaccine and it not be effective. The second concern we have is if the virus mutates, it's possible that people who were infected once could get reinfected because it's a different virus. I've heard anecdotally, I talked to some of my friends in New York, some clinicians who have said that there is a concern that this new mutation actually is very different and it is much more potent. So yes, it really is a concern. And that's why it's just, it's so important. The challenge for us, John, is that, and this is not to speak to any political party, but the fact that someone has introduced into our culture the nomenclature of fake news really raises the question of who do you believe? And
Right.
So I think it's given a lot of people an excuse to just not believe anything. So you see all these people on the beach in Florida and in Georgia, just where they had to close the beaches back down again because people just don't, I think they just don't believe this is real, but this is as real as they come. And we're going to see it if the rate increases due to people basically ignoring what the science says. So it's unfortunate that we don't know who to believe. Next question.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Next question: What's a realistic time frame for a vaccine?
So some people are saying by 2021. I heard, again, I just heard anecdotal from colleagues of mine who are kind of on the front line that England is close to a vaccine. They may have one in September. What a friend of mine told me, who he's a researcher at Vanderbilt, is that the level of technology and science that we have now, we know more in 6 months than we knew about AIDS in 6 years. So the technology and the ability, the gene sequencing and all the capability that we have now is so much more magnified than it's ever been. So I think it's very possible that in the next, 6 to 9 months, we could have a vaccine.
Well, we'll hope for that. Next question, Dr. Williams. Given the rarity of tests in the United States, I can't imagine any situations where asymptomatic individuals would be tested. So this would make it seem that accurate representation of cases in lethality is difficult. Is that an accurate thought process?
That is completely accurate. Is that our predictions on the lethality, that is, we think it's right now about 7% of those people who get it will die. It's because we don't have a denominator that's accurate. So it could be much lower if we tested more people and said, oh my God, well, 100,000 more other people had it and didn't die. So really, it's not as lethal as we think. The other concern, I think, is, and gosh, I'm gonna just fess up in front of everybody. I'm a little concerned about having something stuck up my nose myself. So I think what might make testing more feasible is a less painful way to get the test done. So a lot of people believe that what is going to emerge, and again, this is due to our ability and our technological ability, is that there will be a blood test. And the best way is, if we really had a test that was specific for COVID-19, is to measure those people who had antibodies to the virus, and that would be ideally the litmus test. Because what we're doing now is we're measuring the number of people who have the virus. And so if you get tested and what they call your viral load is not high enough, it'll say you're negative. But maybe a day later or 2 days later, that viral load will be higher. So we could have missed that window, where I think getting the blood test would be a little bit more accurate way of helping us control the disease. And more people, I think, would be subject to a blood test. Some people are saying there's actually going to be a sputum test. So I think ease of testing and comfortability of the procedure and the process might get people more willing to have more mass testing.
Excellent. Is there any talk of cloning antibodies to the virus?
That is one area that I do not know about. I have not heard anything about that. So that's out of my knowledge base. Sorry about that.
And I have an interesting comment here. It seems almost criminal how we're treating nursing homes. Instead of taking virus positive patients and workers out and putting them in safe houses, we incubate the positive to infect everyone in the facility. Do you have a comment on that?
I think it's just, our whole nursing home system has some challenges, so that, there are not enough places. And it's not just nursing homes, it's even in hospitals. Until people started building these COVID specific hospitals, like I know here in Nashville, they were ready to actually set up the convention center as a COVID hospital. I know they did that in New Orleans. I know that in New York, what they did is they designated certain hospitals as COVID hospitals, so they could just keep COVID patients there. But because we don't have those capabilities, and because, who's going to designate their nursing home as the COVID nursing home, people are left to deal with the situation themselves. And quite frankly, it depends on the leadership at that nursing home and the support they get from the federal government and healthcare, healthcare, the Department of Health, et cetera, on how to manage that. That's how well it's managed. So if they get no support and, they're concerned about going out of business, then they're like, well, why don't we just, corner off room 716 and keep everybody else on the end of the hallway, the other end of the hallway. And that's our way of quarantining. So, I think now that they are pretty certain that the N95 mask is an actual effective protective barrier for managing patients with the disease. I think now it may make more sense to isolate someone in place and make sure that the people who are taking care of that person have the proper protective wear. You can effectively manage that patient in the same place. But I think early on, we did a very poor job of that, and that's why it just spread throughout the organization. If you don't wash your hands and, people are touching surfaces and we're passing trays and all kinds of stuff, well, it's gonna go crazy.
Thank you. Next question. I'm a dental hygienist. When do you see us going back to work? Our jobs are already high risk.
Yeah, my wife is a dental hygienist and she was just cringing at the thought of, being actively working because you're dealing in the mouth. And I think now that we know the protective barriers that need to be put in place, you're just going to have to exercise extreme caution as they slowly ramp open cities. As an example, I think in Nashville, the clinicians can open their offices in phase 2, which would be 2 weeks from this Friday. So what I would use as an example, I would insist on what they call a rubber dam, which goes over the mouth. I would have an N95 mask for all my patients. I would have, nice tight fitting gloves. I would have a mask. You can have a clear visor to also protect you in case the patient, coughs or spits out or like that. So I think really it's not a matter of when, it's just making sure that when you go back, you have all of the necessary personal protective equipment to protect yourself from patients, just like the nurses and doctors who are on the front lines right now. I think by the time we're ready to open up, that will be solved. There'll be no mystery. You just need to make sure you know what it is you have to put in place.
Great answer. Next question is for you, John. Going back to the economy, what do you think the chances of a V-shaped recovery are?
It's a great question because Larry Kudlow, right, is always on TV talking about it's going to be great. And I think one of the things we have to do is recognize who's representing what entity. If I'm an employee of the government, that's probably the speech I have to give with all sincerity. And Larry Kudlow will not remember me, but I will always remember meeting him. So what I'm saying is, look, I hope I'm wrong. I hope it is a V-shaped recovery. But to be perfectly honest, I don't see it because all the things that we're talking about right here, I mean, how quickly are you going to be, Daniel, you and Millie just went to Disneyland for your anniversary, right? How quickly are you going to be running back to Disneyland? Yeah. Who's going to be jumping on there? Who's going to be going to a hotel, all right? Getting our dental work done, all right? You're afraid to go outside of your house. In fact, Daniel, we were just talking with a client yesterday. What did she come across? She went to the mailbox and there was a snake. She says, I'm going back inside. I think that's how it's going to be. So if it's V-shaped, great. And I'll tell you one more piece of this, and that is, here's the piece of the puzzle that no one's talking about it, and it's not political. It's just where we are today. We have more people globally 65 and older than 5 and younger. Wrap your mind around that. So, when you're in your 60s and your 70s, you're reaching for the couch and hopefully you don't fall out of it and break your hip. but you're not going to be jumping up and down as though you're on a, Pokemon or, the whatever game there might be, and having the time of your life. It just doesn't work that way. So it could be swoosh shaped, it could be U shaped, it could be W. Keep in mind, everybody's getting older, all right? And in the US of A, the life expectancy is mid-80s. What I think is most likely to occur is what has happened twice before. That's an L-shaped recovery with a, the L being long on the plateau. L, not going vertically, going horizontally. Okay, so the two times we've seen this, we don't study history, we hate math, so we don't look at these things. But the first time we had an L-shaped recovery was after the Great Depression. And what I mean by that is it took, by some accounts, 25 years for the stock market to come back to even, 25 years. It took 40 years for real estate in New York City to come back to even. Now, wrap your mind around, you had $1 million in stocks, $1 million in real estate, whatever it might be, that's $2 million. And between the two, the stocks went to 108, the real estate went to 300. So you had 2 million, you wake up 30, 40, 50 months later to approximately $400,000. Really? Have a nice day. And let's recognize, if you were an adult in the early 1900s, life expectancy was mid-50s. So that suggests to me that the prices came back long after we as adults in the early 1900s were well dead. So that also suggests, and by the way, this is one of the reasons we're doing this kind of work, because recognizing that reality motivates the heck out of me. It's like, I do not want to be part and parcel to people experiencing regret throughout their life. We want to live life. We want to be able to tell our own stories. We don't just want to be a victim and be, go from who's who to who's she or he. I mean, it's just not any fun. Now, there's been a second occurrence most of us have not seen. You might remember, to a person, we all agreed 1988, 1989, Japan was going to be #1 in gross domestic product. Period, end of story. We were good with that. They've got the sun on their flag. Let them enjoy the sun. They'll take over from here. We're good. We'll be #2. They'll be #1. They never got to #1. Now, it appears as though when we study Japan, that they peaked both in stocks and in real estate just around the beginning of the end of the year, 1989. Definitely on the stock market, where the stock market, the Nikkei 225 was about 39,000. And then about 1991, 12 months later, looked like real estate peaked. So the stock market, when Larry Kudlow says buy the dips, will you tell me how this would have worked for you? Okay, so if you were in the Nikkei 225, you were at 39,000. The first dip below was to 10,000. The second dip below was to 7,000. There's an 80% loss. And then the real estate market dropped 70%. So now, I'm going to ask you a question. If you want to respond, just send it to Daniel. He'll tell you, he'll read off the answers. But I want to say, first and foremost, it's a trick question. Don't miss that part. So the question is, what do you think? Which one do you think has gotten back to even since 1990, 1991? Has it been the Japanese stock market, or has it been the Japanese real estate market? Type in your answers, please. I don't expect you to know the answer. Well, I'll give it to you, but it's a good way to process these things. And part of what we're doing with you right now is thinking. And we need to do more of that. And we need to have these conversations with our families and our children, because it's not just about if you're 1%er, you're golden. And if you're not much. Got any answers, Daniel?
Stock market.
Stock market. Okay, so the numbers with the stock market, 39,000 approximately late 1989. And so when I looked a couple of weeks ago, it was the Nikkei 225 was about 24,000. Last time I looked, it was about 20,000. So it went from 39 to 10 to 7. Now let's say it's around 20,000 or so. So the answer is false with the stock market. And that's why I tried to kind of guide you by saying it's a trick question, because the correct answer is D, none of the above. None of the above. Neither the stock market nor the real estate market 30 years later are back to where they were 1990, 1991. Try and wrap your mind around that. And one projection I saw said that the Japanese stock market, I'm sorry, Japanese real estate market, this was written in 2017, suggested that the real estate market would recover in 2025. Well, here comes COVID-19. So much for that thought.
That's right.
So I think it'll be more L-shaped. That's how I see it. We'll see, but we want to play both sides. We want to enjoy the melt up wherever there can be profits, but we want to protect your assets from being crushed at a meltdown.
Excellent. Thank you guys, appreciate it. And we're gonna be doing this for the next few weeks. On the screen, you see a list of our next 3 events. Sorry.
Dr. Williams, can we have you come back? Because I thought you did a great job, and I thought they're really terrific questions.
Yeah.
So can we keep you on deck, if you will, from time to time, checking in, and you can give us your assessment, and clearly you are on the front line, both personally and professionally. So you have an opinion that's certainly an informed point of view.
Absolutely, John. Anytime you guys need me.
Beautiful.
And it's been an honor. I really, I just tell people, you got to keep an open mind, because you really don't know what's fact or fiction. And there's, you just have to gather a bunch of different opinions and formulate the best opinion. You cannot listen to one source. It's just, it's unfortunate, but you got to do a little homework.
Do your homework. Oh, that's a habit we kind of got out of habit of doing, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to say that, these last 2 months have caught a lot of people by surprise. We're going to suggest that if the last 2 months caught you by surprise, you may not be very well prepared for the next 20 years. So, do not think hope is a strategy. Do not buy and hold no matter what. Do not get overly complacent with anything. And do not get so comfortable with a particular position because it had a less than a loss than others. In other words, how much money are you going to need to make work optional when you want to? That's the question. And you have to answer that question. But you've got to look at what you're trying to do and then look to see how you're doing regularly. It might need to be monthly. It might need to be quarterly. It can't be no less than once a year. Otherwise, you don't know what's going on and you're constantly feeling like something's awry, but you don't see how am I doing relative to what I'm trying to accomplish. That's what we want to see, to help you see. So if we can be helpful to you in those regards, please let us know. That's the work we like to do. And we do have a reduction going on in terms of how we do some of the work that we do at a discount. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully you'll be back with us next Wednesday. Bring a friend, and we have Dr. Williams back. Please make sure that you include your friends and family.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks, everybody.